I never thought I'd witness such a scene. My parents, two people once hailed by all of Franklin as paragons of honor and virtue, standing by the creek, letting a small wooden box drift away in the current. At first, I thought it was a memorial ritual for Lucia, my sister, who had died just a few days earlier. But as I followed the creek and saw the box caught on the bank, I bent down and opened its lid, and the world around me seemed to collapse. What was inside not only left me stunned, but also made me realize the honor the Beaumont family had always prided itself on was built on an unforgivable sin. Hello, my name is Mason Beaumont. I'm 31 years old, living in a tiny apartment in Nashville, where I spend my days with a camera, capturing the everyday moments people often overlook. The sunset peeking from behind an old rooftop, a child's smile on the street, or the breeze rustling through the trees. I love the freedom, the feeling of breathing without being scrutinized, unbound by names or reputations. But living like that isn't always easy, especially when you carry the Beaumont name, a name as heavy as a boulder pressing down on my shoulders since I was a child. I grew up in Franklin, Tennessee, about a 30-minute drive from Nashville. Our home was an old, sprawling estate with towering white columns and a meticulously tended garden that looked like a painting. People called it the Beaumont legacy, where 3 generations of my family had built an empire, not just of wealth, but of reputation. My father, Harrison Beaumont, was the head of the family. At 58, he still carried an air of authority. Tall, with neatly combed silver hair and piercing eyes that seemed to cut through any lie. He was a successful businessman who turned the family fortune into a symbol of Southern prosperity. But to me, he was like a king in his own kingdom, where everything had to follow his rules, from how we dressed and spoke to how we breathed. My mother, Beatrice, was different. At 55, she was elegant in every gesture, no matter how small, from the way she lifted a glass of wine to the way she smiled at charity galas. She was beautiful, flawlessly so, as if she had stepped out of a classical painting. But I knew that behind her smile lay a quiet fear of being forgotten, of disappointing my father, of cracking the perfect veneer our family had crafted. She always tried to do everything right, keeping everyone in the household on track, but sometimes I caught a fleeting, lost look in her eyes, as if she herself didn't know what she was living for. And then there was Lucia, my 25-year-old sister, the pride and joy of both my parents. Lucia was the only light in that cold house. She had golden hair that shone like sunlight, clear blue eyes, and a smile that could melt even the hardest hearts. My parents raised her to be the perfect Beaumont woman, intelligent, graceful, and capable of turning heads. But I knew that deep down, Lucia didn't want to be just a polished statue on display. She loved painting, the freedom of brushstrokes on canvas, and dreams she only dared whisper to me late at night when the house was asleep. Lucia was the only one in the family who made me feel a flicker of warmth, a trace of genuine love amidst the rigid formalities. The Beaumonts were Franklin's elite. We appeared in church every Sunday, dressed in expensive clothes, smiling for the cameras of local newspapers. We hosted charity events, sponsored cultural gatherings, and were praised as the model Southern family. But behind the iron gates of the estate, things were far from perfect. Every meal was a ritual, where conversations were carefully curated, as if a single wrong word could bring the world crashing down. My father ruled with the sternness of a dictator. My mother quietly complied, and I felt like an outsider lost in the very home where I grew up. I still remember the days when I was young, when Lucia and I would sneak into the garden behind the house, lie on the grass, and watch the clouds drift by. Lucia would tell me about her dreams, of becoming an artist, painting the world as she saw it, free from our parents' expectations. I'd laugh and tell her she could do it, that one day we'd leave this place and live a life where we didn't have to perform. But whenever I mentioned leaving, Lucia would go quiet, her eyes tinged with fear. She loved our parents, no matter how stifling they were, and I knew she didn't want to disappoint them. As for me, I gave up trying to please my father long ago. At 19, I left Franklin, moved to Nashville, and became a freelance photographer. I wanted a simple life where I could be myself, not Harrison Beaumont's son. But even after leaving, I couldn't completely sever the ties to my family. I returned to Franklin for holidays or obligatory family events. Each time I stepped through the estate's gates, I felt suffocated, as if the air thickened and pressed against my chest. Family dinners were always silent, filled only with the clink of cutlery on porcelain plates and my father's questions about my work, not out of care, but to check if I'd done anything to disgrace the family. My mother would try to lighten the mood with stories about charity events, but her eyes always darted to my father, seeking his approval. Lucia, in rare moments, would sneak me a small smile, as if to say she was still there, still my sister. Everything in our family seemed calm, like the still surface of a Tennessee lake under the sun. But I knew that beneath it, undercurrents were silently stirring. Some nights, sitting alone in my Nashville apartment, I thought about Lucia, my mother, my father, and wondered if the Beaumont's perfect facade could hide its cracks forever. I felt the suffocation building like a storm approaching, and I feared that when it finally hit, none of us would emerge unscathed. The cracks began to show at a community event in Franklin, an annual affair where the Beaumont family was always the center of attention. It was a crisp autumn day, the sky clear and blue, the air carrying the scent of dry leaves and the faint sound of violins drifting from an outdoor stage. I stood at the edge of the public garden, my camera hanging loosely around my neck, quietly observing the crowd. My father, as usual, was shaking hands with local politicians. My mother smiled gracefully beside the town's elite women, and Lucia, my sister, looked radiant in a pale green dress, moving through the crowd like a gentle breeze. But that day, I noticed something different in her eyes. There was a spark, not the polished glow honed by years of etiquette lessons, but a genuine light, as if she were guarding a secret. I didn't think much of it until I saw Lucia pause near a secluded corner of the event where a young man stood. He wore a simple white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, his brown hair tousled, and a smile as bright as sunlight. That was Eli Turner, a mechanic from a small garage on the outskirts of town. I'd met him a few times in passing in Franklin, a hard-working, down-to-earth guy who had a way of putting people at ease. Lucia and Eli were talking, starting with polite small talk, but their eyes lingered on each other longer than usual. From a distance, I sensed a shift in the air, as if an invisible thread had just been pulled taut between them. Their relationship bloomed quietly, like wildflowers growing between cracks in stone. Lucia started slipping away from the family's tedious gatherings, making excuses to go out, and I knew she was meeting Eli. They dated in secret, often in places where no one would notice. A small cafe on the edge of town or a quiet corner of a park at sunset. I caught them once driving past a riverside road. Lucia was sitting on a wooden bench, Eli beside her, both laughing, their hands tightly clasped. I stopped the car and watched them from afar, my heart warming. Lucia looked truly happy, as if she'd found a piece of herself she'd always longed for. But that happiness was as fragile as a petal in the wind. It wasn't long before rumors began to spread. Franklin was a small town where secrets had a way of slipping through walls. A friend of my mother's saw Lucia and Eli together at a farmer's market. A guest at a charity event whispered about spotting the Beaumont girl with a common man. Those murmurs quickly reached my father's ears. And when Harrison Beaumont heard something that displeased him, the world seemed to stop turning. I still remember that dinner, the air in the dining room heavy as lead. My father sat at the head of the table, his eyes icy, his lips pressed into a tight line. My mother tried to maintain her composure, but her hand trembled as she poured water. Lucia sat across from me, her head bowed, her golden hair hiding her eyes. No one spoke. The only sound was the dry clink of cutlery against porcelain plates. Then my father spoke, his voice low and sharp as a blade. "Lucia, where were you this afternoon?" She looked up, attempting a smile, but I saw her lips quiver. I was just taking a walk, Father." "A walk?" He raised an eyebrow, his gaze drilling into her. "With a mechanic?" The room froze. My mother stopped breathing, her hand clutching her napkin. I looked at Lucia, my heart pounding, wanting to say something to protect her, but my throat tightened. Lucia tried to respond, her voice barely a whisper. "He's a good person, Father." "He? Good?" My father cut her off, his voice booming like thunder. "A low-life, uneducated, nameless nobody, and you dare call him good? You're disgracing the Beaumont name." Lucia lowered her head, tears silently falling onto her untouched plate. My mother quickly intervened, her voice trembling. "Harrison, please, calm down. It's probably just a misunderstanding." But her eyes were vacant, as if she didn't believe her own words. I looked at my father, then my mother, then Lucia, feeling a quiet anger smoldering in my chest. But I knew that if I spoke up now, things would only get worse. From that day, Lucia changed. She spoke less, often retreating to the garden behind the house, sitting alone with her easel and paints. Her artwork grew darker, filled with heavy grays and deep blues, as if she were trying to paint her inner turmoil. She started avoiding family events, citing exhaustion or busyness. But I knew she was clinging to the last scraps of her freedom, the happiness she'd found with Eli. Then one day, Lucia came to me. She knocked on my Nashville apartment door late one evening, her hair disheveled, her eyes gleaming with a mix of joy and fear. "Mason," she whispered, gripping my hands tightly, "I'm pregnant." I was stunned, at a loss for words. Part of me wanted to hug her, to congratulate her, because I could see the joy in her eyes. But another part knew this news would be a bomb detonating in the Beaumont household. "Lucia," I asked, my voice hoarse, "have you told our parents?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know they won't accept it. But I love Eli. He's everything I've ever dreamed of. I believe they'll understand if I can just explain." I hugged her, but my heart was heavy. I knew my father. I knew his sense of honor mattered more than anything, even his daughter's love. The next day, Lucia told our parents. As expected, my father erupted in rage. He called Eli a gold digger, called Lucia a traitor to the Beaumont blood. He forbade her from leaving the house, cut off all contact with the outside world, and turned her into a prisoner in her own home. My mother, as always, stayed silent, but I could see her growing more haggard, as if each of my father's words was a knife cutting into her heart. I tried to speak up, to convince my father that Lucia had the right to love who she wanted, that honor wasn't everything. But he looked at me like I was a stranger, his eyes filled with contempt. "Mason," he said, his voice cold as ice, "if you say one more word, you're a traitor to this bloodline too." I felt powerless, but I couldn't stand by and watch Lucia be caged. I met her in secret at night, whispering through her locked bedroom door, promising I'd find a way to help her. But before I could act, Lucia took matters into her own hands. One night, when the house was asleep, she ran away with Eli. She left a small note on my desk, simple and brief. "Mason, thank you. I'll be okay." The next morning, Franklin was abuzz. Rumors spread like wildfire. My father, with his wealth and influence, quickly silenced the gossip. He announced publicly that Lucia had gone to study art in Europe, pursuing a prestigious program. The local papers, dependent on the Beaumonts' generosity, dutifully echoed the story. But I knew the truth. I knew Lucia had chosen love, even if it cost her everything. After Lucia ran away, she vanished into thin air. No letters, no calls, no trace. My father, with his power and wealth, erased every clue about her. The newspapers stopped reporting, the whispers in Franklin gradually faded, and the name Lucia Beaumont was buried under the fabricated story of her study abroad in Europe. But sometimes in the quiet afternoons in Nashville, I heard vague rumors that someone had seen a girl resembling Lucia in a small town south of Franklin, living in an old wooden house with a man. I wanted to believe it was true, that Lucia was living happily with Eli, but every time I thought of it, my heart ached. I hadn't protected her, hadn't kept my promise to help her escape the cage of our family. My father forbade mentioning Lucia's name in the house. Whenever my mother or I accidentally let her name slip, he would glare at us with icy eyes, his voice low and cutting. "This family has no such person." My mother would lower her head silent while I clenched my fists under the table, trying to suppress my anger. Dinners became a lifeless ritual where we sat together but felt like shadows, unable to meet each other's eyes. My mother grew thinner, her eyes red and swollen, but she never spoke. I knew she carried a heavy burden of guilt, but she chose silence, as she had her whole life to preserve the perfect image of the Beaumont family. Months passed, and Lucia's name was slowly forgotten in that sprawling estate. I returned to Nashville, resuming my photography work, but every time I picked up my camera, I saw Lucia's face in my mind. Her radiant smile, her dreamy eyes. I wondered where she was, whether she was happy, whether the child in her womb was born into love. But there were no answers. Only long nights spent sitting by my window, watching the city lights and praying for my sister. Then one morning, everything changed. I was in my apartment, brewing coffee, when the phone rang. My mother's trembling voice came through. "Mason, come home now. Something important has happened." I asked what was wrong, but she only repeated, "Come now, Mason. Please." My heart raced, a sense of dread surging like a wave. I jumped in my car and drove frantically to Franklin, unsure of what I was about to face. When I stepped into the estate, the air was heavy as lead. My father sat in the living room holding a white envelope with the seal of Colton County Hospital. My mother stood behind him, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly. The housekeeper, Martha, stood in the corner, her eyes red and teary. I looked at my father, waiting, but he only pushed the envelope toward me, his voice low and deathly. "Read it." My hands trembled as I opened it. The words on the paper danced before my eyes. The hospital reported that a patient named Lucia Beaumont had died after giving birth, due to obstetric complications. She passed away just hours after delivery with no family or husband by her side. The newborn was still alive, temporarily under the hospital's care. No one had come to claim the child. I read it over and over, as if reading it long enough would change the words, turn it into a different story. But no, it was real. Lucia, my sister, was dead, alone, with no one by her side. I collapsed into a chair, feeling the world crumble around me. "When?" I asked, my voice hoarse. My father looked at me, his eyes empty. "The letter arrived 2 days ago." 2 days. He had kept it secret for 2 days, as if his daughter's death was just a detail to be handled discreetly. My mother burst into tears, but she wouldn't look at me. I wanted to scream, to smash everything, but I just sat there, numb, the image of Lucia's radiant smile now cutting into my heart like a knife. Lucia's funeral was held soon after, arranged meticulously by my father, discreet and elegant within the estate's grounds. Only a few close relatives were invited. No press, no outside guests, no whispers of the truth. My father wanted it kept within the family to protect the Beaumont reputation. He didn't even mention the baby, only saying curtly, "Everything has been handled." I looked at him, wanting to ask about the child, to know where it was, but his gaze was like a stone wall, stopping me. "Don't interfere, Mason," he said, his voice cold as ice. "This isn't your concern." The funeral took place on a misty morning. Lucia lay in a white coffin surrounded by lilies, her favorite flower. She looked peaceful, as if asleep, but I knew she was no longer there. My mother stood beside her, frail as a shadow, her eyes red but too dry for more tears. The few attendees, distant relatives and close friends, mourned the image of a dutiful, perfect Lucia, the ideal Beaumont daughter. No one dared mention the woman who had loved the wrong person, who had run away to live true to her heart. I stood before her portrait, overwhelmed with guilt. I hadn't protected her. I had left her alone in her final moments. Lucia didn't die from childbirth. She died because she was denied the right to live freely, rejected by her own family. After the burial, everyone quietly left. I asked my father about the baby again, but he turned away, saying I didn't need to worry. My mother looked at me, her eyes pleading, but she said nothing. I knew she was dying inside from the pain, but she lacked the courage to face the truth. That night, after everyone had left the cemetery, I stayed behind. The Franklin mist hung thick and cold, wrapping me like a damp blanket. I stood before Lucia's grave, quietly recalling the days of our childhood, when she'd grab my hand and run through the garden, laughing amid falling petals. "Mason," she once said, "one day I'll paint the whole world and you'll capture it with your camera, okay?" I promised I would, but now I stood here before a cold gravestone with promises I'd never kept. I knelt down, placing my hand on the freshly turned earth, and whispered, "Lucia, I'm sorry." Tears rolled down my cheeks, blending into the mist. A few weeks after the funeral, I returned to the Beaumont estate to visit my mother. I didn't want to go, didn't want to step into that oppressive, gloomy space, but I couldn't leave her alone. She was growing frailer by the day, her eyes sunken as if her soul had left with Lucia. The air in the house was heavy, suffocating, like a living tomb. No one spoke of Lucia. Her name was taboo, as if she had never existed. My father maintained his steely exterior, controlling everything with cold precision. But I caught glimpses of a lost look in his eyes, as if he too was fleeing from his own shadow. My mother was quieter than ever, moving like a ghost, her hands trembling as she held her teacup. I wanted to say something, to break the deadly silence, but every time I looked into her eyes, I saw only unspoken pain. I couldn't bear it. I needed air, needed to escape the house that was choking me. I walked out to the garden behind the house where Lucia and I used to play as children. The garden was still beautiful, with neatly trimmed rose bushes and a small creek babbling over stones. I stopped by the creek, taking a deep breath, trying to find a shred of peace. There I remembered the time-lapse camera I'd set up months ago, when I'd wanted to capture the beauty of nature to escape the family's tensions. The camera was still there, hidden under foliage, silently recording every moment of the creek. I retrieved the camera and checked the footage, thinking the images might bring me some comfort. But when the screen lit up, my heart stopped. Just hours earlier, at sunset, the camera had captured something I never could have imagined. My parents appeared by the creek, their postures rigid, as if doing something they didn't want anyone to see. My father held a small wooden box wrapped in white cloth, his face tense, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if afraid of being caught. My mother stood beside him, her head bowed, her hands clenched tightly. Then, as if resolved, my father released the box into the creek. It floated silently with the current, bobbing gently in the ripples before my parents turned and walked away, as if nothing had happened. I stood frozen, gripping the camera, my heart pounding. What was that box? Why had my parents done this? A chilling sense of dread surged through me like a cold wave. I couldn't make sense of it, but I knew something was terribly wrong. Without thinking, I ran along the creek, my eyes fixed on the water, searching for the box. The creek wound through the garden, weaving between tree roots and stones. I ran nearly a mile, my breath ragged, my feet slipping on the damp earth, but I didn't stop. Then, among the tangled roots along the bank, I saw it, the small wooden box caught, swaying gently in the water. I rushed forward, the icy water soaking my shoes, but I didn't care. I lifted the box, my hands trembling. It was heavier than I expected, and as I touched it, I felt a fragile sense of life within. My heart raced, threatening to burst. I set the box on the bank, opened the lid, and the world seemed to stop. Inside, wrapped in a white cotton cloth, was a newborn baby. Its lips were bluish, its eyes closed, but its tiny chest rose and fell faintly. It was alive. I was stunned, unable to believe my eyes. This baby. I was certain it was Lucia's child, the grandchild my father had said was handled. My heart tore apart. My parents, the people who raised me, who taught me about honor and family, had done this. They had set the baby adrift in the creek, left it to die. The honor of the Beaumont family, which my father placed above all else, had turned him into someone I no longer recognized. I clutched the baby to my chest, pulling my jacket around it to keep it warm. Hot tears streamed down my face as I ran toward the main road. The sound of the creek behind me felt like an accusation echoing in my mind. I didn't know what to do, only that I had to save this child, to protect it from the world that had taken its mother. I ran, my heart pounding erratically, my breath coming in gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. In that moment, I understood that the honor of the Beaumont family wasn't just a facade, it was a monster, ready to devour even humanity itself. My parents, for the sake of their so-called reputation, had chosen to abandon their own flesh and blood. I couldn't forgive them, couldn't comprehend it, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't let this baby suffer the same fate as its mother. That night, I left the estate with the child. I drove to Nashville, holding it close, feeling its faint breath against my chest. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know how I'd face my parents, but I knew this was the start of a new chapter, one woven with love, guilt, and redemption in the shadows. I looked down at the baby, its eyes fluttering open, and whispered, "Lucia, I won't let your child suffer. I promise." I didn't return to Nashville right away. I knew that if my parents discovered the baby, they would do everything in their power to cover up the truth, to preserve the perfect facade of the Beaumont family. Instead, I drove to a small town over an hour from Franklin, far enough that no one would recognize me. The night was bitterly cold, the sky full of stars, but all I could see were the bluish lips of the baby in my arms. I sought out a private clinic on the outskirts, its flickering neon sign like a final flame of hope. I knocked, almost pounded, on the door until a nurse opened it, her eyes widening at the sight of me clutching a newborn, my jacket soaked from the creek. "Help me," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "The baby. It needs to be saved." The nurse didn't ask many questions, quickly ushering me into the emergency room. The hours that followed passed like a slow nightmare. I sat in the hallway, my hands still trembling, the sharp smell of antiseptic thick around me. The doctor, a middle-aged man with calm eyes, worked tirelessly to save the baby. I didn't dare take my eyes off the door to the intensive care unit, as if blinking might make the child disappear. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor emerged, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's stable," he said, "but the boy is very weak. If you'd arrived a few hours later, he might not have made it." A boy. Lucia's son. I nodded, feeling as if a boulder had been lifted from my chest. I was led to a room where the boy lay in an incubator, tiny and fragile but alive. I placed my hand on the glass, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you, Lucia," I whispered. "You were strong until the end." I named him Lucian, a name meaning light in Latin. It was my prayer that his life would rise above the darkness he was born into, above the world that had taken his mother. I couldn't let Lucian grow up in the deceit of the Beaumont family, couldn't let him be bound by the so-called honor that had destroyed Lucia. I knew I had to protect him no matter the cost. I returned to Nashville but didn't go back to my old apartment. I found a new, small place in a quiet corner of the city where no one knew who I was. I filed papers to adopt Lucian as a single foster father, using the address of my photography studio to avoid any ties to Franklin. I didn't tell my parents or anyone else. I severed every thread that could lead them to Lucian. Each day I cared for him, changing diapers, preparing bottles, staying up through sleepless nights when he cried. My life now revolved around Lucian, simple but deeply meaningful. I was no longer Mason Beaumont, heir to a prestigious lineage. I was just Mason, the father of a boy who needed love. Every time I looked at Lucian's face, I saw Lucia. He had her clear blue eyes, the innocent smile she'd had as a child, and the serenity she had never been allowed to experience. Sometimes, when he slept, I sat beside him watching, and it felt like Lucia was still here, smiling at me. But then the memory of the creak, of the wooden box, yanked me back to reality. I couldn't forgive my parents, couldn't fathom how they could do it, abandon their own flesh and blood just to protect an empty reputation. In the long nights, with Lucian sleeping soundly, I sat at the kitchen table writing everything down. I recorded every detail. From the day I received Lucia's death notice to the moment I opened the wooden box by the creek. Those pages were like an indictment, a record of the Beaumont family's sins. I tucked them into a locked drawer, not for revenge, but to remind myself that I had to do right by Lucian. Under the dim light of my apartment, I vowed to raise him as my own, to give him a life of freedom, unbound by honor or bloodline. Lucian would not live in the cage Lucia had tried to escape. In Franklin, my parents carried on as if nothing had happened. They believed the baby, their grandchild, had been handled. They attended charity galas, smiled for cameras, and upheld the flawless image of the Beaumonts. I didn't know if they ever thought of Lucia, if they ever felt guilt for what they'd done. All I knew was that every time I looked at Lucian, I saw a part of Lucia living on, and I would do anything to protect that light. Over the years, I gradually cut contact with my family. I still returned to Franklin for holidays, but only to check on my mother to make sure she was okay. Our visits were brief and awkward. My father still asked about my work, but never about my life. My mother looked at me with sad eyes, as if wanting to say something but lacking the courage. I kept Lucian a secret, ensuring they never suspected. I knew that if they found out about him, they would try to control him, to pull him into the world I'd sworn to shield him from. But deep down, I knew the truth couldn't stay buried forever. One day, those pages in the locked drawer would be opened. And when that happened, the honor my father had guarded his entire life would crumble. I didn't long for that day, but I didn't fear it either. I had chosen my path, one of love and redemption, the path Lucia hadn't been able to walk to the end. 8 years have quietly passed since the night I left the Beaumont estate, holding Lucian in my arms, and I've learned that true love lies not in grand promises but in simple moments. A hug, a smile, or the look in a child's eyes that melts your heart. I'm now a quiet man, living discreetly in a small house on the outskirts of Nashville. The house is nothing special, a few framed photos on the walls, a cluttered workspace filled with papers and cameras, and a colorful little room for Lucian. Our life is simple, sometimes challenging but brimming with love. I work freelance, taking photos for local magazines and occasionally larger projects in distant cities. But no matter how busy I get, I always make time for Lucian, the 8-year-old boy who has become the center of my world. Lucian is a remarkable child. He's intelligent, sensitive, and has a talent for painting that leaves me in awe. Every time he picks up a brush, it's as if Lucia comes alive again. His strokes are vibrant yet gentle, like the dreams his mother once poured onto canvas. He loves sitting for hours by the window, painting fields, streams, or simply the sunlight glinting on leaves. I often stand quietly watching him, my heart aching at the sight of his clear blue eyes, so like Lucia's, as if she's still here through him, reminding me of my promise. Our life isn't always easy. Some nights I lie awake worrying about money, Lucian's future, and whether I'm doing enough to give him a good life. But every time he runs to me, wrapping his arms around me and shouting, "Dad Mason, look at this painting," all my exhaustion fades. I'm not his biological father, but to me, Lucian is everything. I've taught him how to tie his shoes, hold a camera, and face tough days with a smile. I want him to grow up believing that life, however harsh, is always worth loving. There are times when work takes me away and I can't bring Lucian along. On those occasions, I reluctantly send him to Franklin to stay at the Beaumont estate with his grandparents for a few days. The first time I did this, my heart twisted with fear. I was terrified my parents would suspect something, that they'd look into Lucian's eyes and see the truth. To prevent that, I crafted a story. Lucian was the son of an old colleague who saved my life in an accident. When the man died of illness, I promised to care for his son and adopted Lucian. My parents didn't ask many questions. Perhaps because they didn't want to dig deeper or because they were used to my unconventional life. But I knew that every time I brought Lucian to Franklin, I was walking a tightrope where the truth could come crashing down at any moment. Lucian quickly won my parents' affection. My father, with his usual sternness, seemed to soften around him. He admired Lucian's politeness and maturity, often nodding approvingly when the boy answered his questions with a clear, confident voice. "This child is well raised," he once said, and I forced a smile, hiding the pang in my chest. My mother was different. She looked at Lucian with a mix of love and pain, as if she saw a familiar shadow in him. Once I caught her standing by the window for hours watching Lucian paint in the garden behind the house. His paintings, with their soft hues, blues, pale yellows, and pinks, were strikingly similar to Lucia's from years ago. I saw her eyes well up, but she said nothing, turning away as if afraid that looking too long would break her. I knew my mother sensed something, though she never spoke of it. There were moments when she held Lucian, stroking his hair, and I saw her hands tremble. "This boy is special, Mason," she once said, her voice choked. "It's as if he carries a piece of someone we lost." I only nodded, unable to meet her eyes. I was afraid that if I said anything, the truth would slip out and everything would collapse. My father paid less attention. To him, Lucian was just a well-mannered child with artistic talent, proof that I had finally done something right. But for my mother, I knew her heart was stirring. Every time Lucian painted, every time he smiled, it was as if she saw Lucia, the daughter she hadn't protected, hadn't had the courage to hold on to. I wanted to tell her the truth, to shout that Lucian was her grandson, the blood of the Beaumonts. But I couldn't. Not out of fear, but because I didn't want Lucian to be dragged into the world that had taken his mother. Each night as Lucian slept soundly, I sat by his bed watching his peaceful face under the glow of the nightlight. Those moments made me realize that the truth, no matter how hard I tried to bury it, was finding its way back. It lived in Lucian's eyes, in his brushstrokes, in the way his smile mirrored Lucia's. I knew that one day I would have to face my parents, Franklin, and the world. But I also knew that when that day came, I wouldn't let Lucian suffer as his mother had. I live for that promise, for my love for Lucian, and for the belief that one day his light will dispel the darkness of the Beaumont family. But deep down, I know the tightrope I'm walking won't hold forever. The truth, like Lucian's paintings, will eventually come to light, and when it does, I'll have to face everything. My parents, the past, and myself. But that spring, as Nashville's gentle sunlight spilled across the streets, I felt a strange breeze, a sign that everything was about to change. I sat in our small house watching Lucian paint by the window, his brush dancing across the canvas, creating vibrant swaths of color. At 8 years old, his talent far surpassed his age. Each of Lucian's paintings was a story, a dream. One morning, while reading the newspaper, I stumbled across an article about the Young Talents of Tennessee competition, a statewide art event for exceptionally gifted children. I looked at Lucian diligently painting a stream glimmering under the sunset, and thought this was his chance to shine, to let the world see the light Lucia had left behind. "Lucian," I called softly, "would you like to try entering a painting competition? Just for fun, and maybe you'll meet other kids who love to paint like you do." He looked up, his blue eyes sparkling but tinged with hesitation. "I don't know, Dad Mason," he said quietly. "What if people don't like my paintings?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "They'll love your paintings because they're as beautiful as you are." After a few days of thought, Lucian nodded, and I saw a spark of confidence in his eyes, the kind I'd always hoped he'd have. We prepared for the competition over the next few weeks. Lucian chose an idea he'd been nurturing for a while, a painting of the garden behind the Franklin estate, where he'd sat and painted with his grandmother Beatrice during visits. He titled it, "The Garden at Dusk." I watched him meticulously mix colors, each brushstroke like a whisper of the memories he shared with her. The golden-orange sunlight scattered over rose bushes, the babbling of the creek. The day of the competition arrived, and Nashville glowed in the spring light. The venue was bursting with color, filled with children from across Tennessee carrying paintings, instruments, and sparkling dreams. Lucian stood among the crowd, small but confident, clutching his carefully wrapped painting. I stood behind him, my heart pounding with pride and nervousness. When the judges called his name, Lucian stepped forward, placing his painting on the easel, and I saw every eye in the room fix on him. The Garden at Dusk was a masterpiece, hues of gold, orange, and blue blending to recreate the Franklin garden like a dream, both tender and vibrant. I heard murmurs of praise, saw the judges' smiles, and knew Lucian had done something extraordinary. The results were announced at the end of the day. When the host declared, "First place goes to Lucian for his work," The Garden at Dusk, the room erupted in applause. Lucian stood there, cheeks flushed, his smile as bright as the sun. He ran to me, whispering, "Dad, Mason, I did it." I hugged him tightly, tears falling silently. It wasn't just Lucian's victory, it was Lucia's, her light still shining through her sun. Lucian's painting not only won first place but also earned him a prestigious scholarship from the Tennessee Young Artists Association. Local newspapers quickly picked up the story, calling him the talented young artist from Franklin. Images of Lucian standing beside his painting with his innocent smile and bright eyes appeared in papers and online. Franklin buzzed, Nashville buzzed, and while I was proud, a quiet unease began to grow. That spotlight, though beautiful, was drawing Lucian closer to the world I'd tried to keep him from. My parents came across the article one morning in Franklin. I wasn't there, but I could imagine the moment. My father sitting at the dining table holding the newspaper, his eyes lighting up at Lucian's name. My mother perhaps pouring tea, pausing, her hand trembling as she saw the boy's photo. They called me soon after, my father's voice brimming with rare excitement. "Mason, your boy has done something big. Our adopted grandson, who would have thought?" My mother said less, but I could hear the emotion in her voice. "Lucian? He's truly special, Mason. Like a gift." They began boasting about their adopted grandson everywhere. At social gatherings, my father introduced Lucian as Franklin's young hope, his voice full of pride as he spoke of the boy's award. "This boy has a rare artistic blood," he said, unaware of how close his words were to the truth. My mother smiled, but I knew her heart was a sea of emotions, pride, guilt, and a vague pain she couldn't name. She often told me about Lucian's visits to Franklin, how he sat painting in the garden, how his artwork reminded her of Lucia's. "There's something about that boy," she said, her voice trembling, "as if he belongs here." I watched from a distance, both joyful and wary. I was happy that Lucian was loved and recognized, but I feared that this spotlight would start to crack the secret I'd kept for 8 years. Every time my parents mentioned Lucian, every time they bragged about him, I felt the fragile tightrope I was walking tremble. The truth about Lucian, that he wasn't the adopted son of a colleague, but their grandson, Lucia's son, was closer than ever to surfacing. I looked at Lucian, the boy with the radiant smile, and wondered if I could protect him from the storm that was coming, or if he would be the one to bring it all to light. I decided to return to Franklin, bringing Lucian with me. It was a spring afternoon with soft golden sunlight stretching across familiar roads. Lucian sat in the back seat, clutching a small sketch pad, softly singing a lullaby I used to sing to him. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, my heart aching at his smile, so like Lucia's. I knew today would be the day everything changed, the day I'd face my parents, the past, and myself. In my coat pocket, I carried an old envelope containing copies of the hospital records and Lucian's birth certificate, papers I'd kept hidden for 8 years. They felt as heavy as lead, as if carrying the weight of the Beaumont family's sins. When we stepped into the estate, the air was as somber as ever. My father sat in the living room reading a newspaper, his eyes as sharp and cold as always. My mother stood by the window holding a teacup, her gaze distant as if lost in some faraway place. Lucian ran to her, calling "Grandma Beatrice," with a cheerful voice, and I saw her smile, but it was laced with pain. My father looked up, nodding at me, his voice low. "Mason, you're back. And our talented boy, too." He glanced at Lucian, a flicker of pride in his eyes, but I knew he still saw him only as an adopted grandson, part of the story I'd fabricated to hide the truth, I smiled at Lucian to reassure him, then said gently, "Lucian, why don't you go play in the garden for a bit? I need to talk to Grandpa and Grandma." He nodded, still carefree, and ran out to the front garden with his sketch pad, where the spring sunlight danced over the rose bushes. I waited until the door closed, until Lucian's footsteps faded into the sound of the babbling creek, before turning back to my parents. I took a deep breath and placed the envelope on the table in front of my father. "Dad, Mom," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I have something to tell you." My father frowned, setting the newspaper down. My mother turned, her teacup trembling in her hand. "Lucian isn't the adopted son of a colleague," I said slowly, as if afraid I'd lose my courage if I spoke too quickly. "He's Lucia's son, your grandson." The room fell silent, as if the air itself had stopped breathing. The ticking of the wall clock marked the slow seconds, counting down the final moments of the honor my parents had so proudly upheld. My father froze, his hand trembling slightly, his eyes locked on the envelope as if unable to believe what was before him. My mother stumbled back a step, her teacup crashing to the floor, shattering into pieces. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and I saw memories flooding back in her eyes. "No," she whispered, her voice choked. "It can't be." But as she looked through the glass door toward the garden, I knew she saw the truth. Lucian's blue eyes, his smile so like Lucia's, the brushstrokes that carried her spirit, all undeniable proof. My father remained silent, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if trying to keep himself from collapsing. I opened the envelope, pulling out the hospital records and birth certificate, and placed them before him. "This is the truth," I said, my voice steady but heavy. "Lucian is Lucia's son, the child you left in the creek, the child you said was handled." The air grew thick, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out. My father bowed his head, and for the first time in my life I saw him speechless. He looked at Lucian, the boy with his daughter's eyes, and I saw the collapse in his gaze. Gone was the commanding presence, the cold control. Only a man remained, facing his own guilt. My mother stepped to the window, trembling as she placed a hand on the glass, looking at Lucian. "Oh, Lucia," she whispered, as if seeing her daughter through the boy. I stood there, silent, not accusing, not angry. I felt only the weight of 8 years lifting, as if I'd given the truth back to Lucia, to myself. Finally, my father spoke, his voice broken and hoarse. "Mason, I'm sorry." It was the first time I'd ever heard him apologize, and it felt like a knife, both painful and freeing. He looked at Lucian, tears rolling down his weathered face. I was wrong. So very wrong. The truth was out. The honor my father had guarded with lies crumbled, leaving only regret and belated love. I didn't hold a grudge. I only sighed, as if shedding the burden I'd carried for 8 years. In that moment, the Beaumont family stopped speaking of honor for the first time. There were only 3 generations standing together. My parents, me, and Lucian, with tears, forgiveness, and a new beginning. I looked at Lucian, the boy still blissfully unaware but smiling, and I knew that no matter how painful the past, we still had a chance to start over, to love each other truly. In the days that followed, the Beaumont estate was cloaked in an unfamiliar silence. My parents, once the centerpiece of Franklin's social scene, all but vanished from public view. Gone were the charity galas, the perfect smiles for cameras, the articles praising the South's model family. My father, Harrison Beaumont, the man who once stood tall like an oak, now seemed aged by decades. He spoke less, often sitting alone in his study, his gaze lost in the garden where Lucia used to paint. My mother, Beatrice, moved like a shadow through the house, her hands perpetually clasped as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. They were confronting their consciences, the mistakes they had tried to bury, and I knew they were in pain. I returned to Nashville, resuming my life with Lucian. I no longer avoided my parents, but I didn't seek them out either. My focus was on the boy, on mornings taking him to school, afternoons painting with him, and nights singing him to sleep. Our life was simple, sometimes strained, but filled with joy. Lucian grew every day, his smile as bright as the sun, his paintings more beautiful than ever. Each time he picked up a brush, I saw Lucia, as if she lived on through her son's every stroke. All I wanted was to keep Lucian's world peaceful, to ensure he never bore the wounds his mother had carried. But one day, everything changed. It was a fall afternoon with golden leaves carpeting Nashville's streets. I had just returned from work when I saw a familiar car parked outside my house, my father's sleek black Lincoln. My heart raced, not out of fear, but because I didn't know why they were here. Lucian was playing in the front yard, wielding a stick as a pretend sword, laughing as he chased a butterfly. My parents stepped out of the car, their movements slow as if carrying the weight of a world full of guilt. My father, in a dark suit, looked weary but maintained his stern demeanor. My mother, with a silk scarf around her neck, had red-rimmed eyes that lit up when she saw Lucian. "Lucian!" she called, her voice trembling. The boy looked up, his smile radiant, and ran to hug her. "Grandma Beatrice!" "Grandpa Harrison!" he cheered, blissfully unaware of the storms that had swept through this family. I stood on the porch watching them, my heart constricting. My parents knelt down, embracing Lucian, and I saw tears stream down my mother's cheeks. My father ruffled the boy's hair, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen, as if he were trying to find a piece of Lucia in his grandson. They didn't say much to me at first. We sat in my small living room, Lucian playing with his paints in the corner while my parents sat across from me, their hands clasped tightly. "Mason," my father began, his voice hoarse, "we're here for Lucian. We want to be part of his life." My mother nodded, tears falling again. "We were wrong, Mason," she said, her voice choked. "We lost Lucia, and we nearly lost Lucian too. We're not here to make amends. We just want to love him truly." I listened in silence. I looked into their eyes, and for the first time I saw no fear of losing reputation, no cold control. I saw only genuine regret, the pain of parents who had lost their daughter and now wanted to reclaim family through their grandson. I nodded, saying little. "All right," I said softly. "But everything has to be for Lucian. Not for reputation, not for the Beaumont name. Only for him." From then on, my parents began visiting Nashville regularly. They brought small gifts for Lucian, a new set of paints, a picture book, or simply a cake my mother baked herself. They provided financial support so I could enroll Lucian in advanced art classes where he could nurture his talent. But more importantly, they spent time with him. My father, once so stern he made the whole house tremble, now sat for hours listening to Lucian talk about his paintings, nodding with genuine interest. My mother held his hand, taking him for walks in the park, her eyes lighting up every time he smiled. Those moments were simple, but to me they were worth more than any reputation. Slowly, we became a family again. Not the perfect family of charity events or newspaper articles, but a real one. Meals at my small house were now filled with Lucian's laughter, my mother's stories, and even my father's clumsy questions about painting. I watched them and I felt at peace. The past couldn't be changed. Lucia was gone and the wounds she left remained. But I understood that people could choose to live differently, to choose genuine love over empty pride. One afternoon, as Lucian painted in his room, my parents sat with me on the porch. My father looked into the distance, his voice low. "Mason, you've done what I never could. You've given that boy a real life." My mother took my hand, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping Lucian, for keeping a piece of Lucia." I said nothing, only nodded, but in my heart, I knew this was what I'd always wanted. A family that didn't need to be perfect, just brave enough to love each other truly. Our family life gradually became simpler and warmer. I continued my photography work in Nashville, but now my camera didn't just capture moments of nature or strangers. I photographed Lucian, painting, running in the park, laughing brightly with his grandparents. I captured our modest dinners where my father shared stories of his youth, my mother smiled gently, and Lucian chimed in with innocent questions. These photos weren't perfect, not staged like the ones from the Beaumont's charity galas, but they held love, the kind I'd spent my life searching for. My father, Harrison Beaumont, once a symbol of power and prestige, changed. He stepped away from the business world, abandoning high-stakes meetings and million-dollar deals. Instead, he devoted himself to charity, funding art scholarships for underprivileged children. I saw him at small exhibitions in Franklin, standing among kids listening to their dreams. Once he brought Lucian to one of these events, and I saw him smile as the boy pointed to a painting and said, "Grandpa Harrison, this looks like the one I did at home." My father patted his shoulder, his eyes alight, not with the obsession for honor, but with the warmth of a grandfather learning to love. My mother, Beatrice, also found a way to heal. She reopened Lucia's painting room at the Franklin estate, a room that had been locked tight since Lucia ran away. She cleaned it, hung Lucia's old paintings, and turned it into a creative space for Lucian. Every time he visited Franklin, he'd run straight to that room, sit at the easel, and create vibrant artworks. My mother would stand nearby, silently watching, and I knew she saw Lucia in every brushstroke. "He's so much like your sister," she once told me, her voice trembling. "It's like she never left." I nodded, holding her hand, feeling the peace she'd rediscovered after years of fear and guilt. More than anyone, I understood that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiveness is learning to live with the past, accepting the wounds and turning them into strength. I didn't forget what my parents had done, the creek, the wooden box, Lucia's pain. But I chose to forgive, not for them, but for myself, for Lucian, and for the dream of a real family. I began writing a memoir, chronicling the Beaumont story. From the stifling days under the veneer of honor to the night I found Lucian, to our journey of rediscovering each other. I wrote not to accuse, but to tell the truth, to remind myself that love is always worth more than any reputation. The memoir ended with a line I wrote on a long night as Lucian slept beside me. "No honor is worth sacrificing love. No tradition is nobler than compassion." Years later, when Lucian was older, he found the memoir in an old drawer. He read it page by page, line by line, and I saw his eyes well up as he came to hug me. "Dad Mason," he said, his voice choked. "Thank you for keeping me, for telling me about Mom." I held him tightly, tears streaming down my face. Lucian understood that our family had once been lost, caught in a whirlwind of honor and lies. But he also saw how we found our way back. Through forgiveness, through the courage to face our mistakes. He carried that lesson not just in his paintings, but in how he lived, how he loved, and how he faced the world. Our story ended on a peaceful afternoon in Franklin. Under the ancient oak tree in the garden, I picked up my camera, ready to take a photo. My father sat on a wooden chair, his silver hair glinting in the sunlight, telling Lucian a story from his youth. My mother sat beside him, her hand entwined with his, smiling gently as Lucian interrupted with innocent questions. I raised the camera, and as they looked toward me, I pressed the shutter. The photo captured that moment. My father, my mother, and Lucian sitting together, their smiles serene, with nothing left to prove, nothing left to hide. Just love, simple and true. Looking at that photo, I knew the Beaumont family had found its path. Not a path of prestige or tradition, but one of compassion. I wanted to leave a message, not just for my family, but for anyone lost in empty values. Honor doesn't lie in bloodlines, but in how we choose to treat those we love. The Beaumonts once thought honor was everything, but we learned it only matters when built on love and sincerity. The truth can hurt, but silence is crueler. I kept Lucian's secret for 8 years, and with each passing day I realized that the truth, however painful, is the only path to liberation. Forgiveness isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about freeing yourself from resentment. I forgave my parents not because they deserved it, but because I wanted to live a life unbound by the past. Sometimes a family doesn't need to be perfect, just brave enough to love truly. I looked at Lucian, the boy who had become my light, my parents' light, and the light of the Beaumont family. Under that oak tree, I knew we'd found what mattered most. Not fame, not tradition, but each other. Each other. Each other. Each other. each other, 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 each other,